My name is Malcolm Fleming, the Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Construction Industry Council. The NZCIC is the peak body of the New Zealand construction industry, whose membership is comprised of 35 construction associations. For the 2020 election, we took the opportunity to develop this list of 6 election platforms that represented the key opportunities and threats that were facing the New Zealand construction industry. We sent the NZCIC election platforms to the building and construction spokesperson for each of the 5 main political parties and invited them to participate in a recorded interview with Radio New Zealand journalist Phil Pennington. Those conversations included each politician being provided with 2 minutes to articulate their party's overarching building and construction policy, following which Phil asked them questions pertaining to the NZCIC election platforms. The result is 5 separate videos, 1 per political party. As the editing is light, the recordings come across as a conversation, with Phil's follow-up questions changing to follow the thread of the politician's answer to Phil's main election platform question. Whether you watch the full series of 5 or only watch those of parties that you're more aligned with, we hope you find that the material informative. The NZIC would like to acknowledge the assistance of Radio New Zealand in creating this series.
Kia ora katoa, and thank you for this opportunity. Look, the construction sector is seen very much as pivotal, both to the New Zealand economy generally and to how we recover from our current economic situation. And I think there's a number of things that I've been involved in, and more generally, one is regulatory reform. So we understand that both in respect of kind of consenting and resource management, that these are impediments to effective and efficient building processes. So you'll probably be aware that there's a bill in front of the House already before Select Committee looking at building products regulation and modular building regulation. And that's really looking at smoothing the pathway for much more effective and productive building methods. In terms of Resource Management Act, that's a job for next term. Very much committed to getting that sorted out so that the construction process can be more streamlined there and more effective, and also, to be fair, more sustainable. I guess the other key aspect of the construction industry that we see needs attention is workforce and the essential skills gap that exists. We've been committed to funding apprenticeships so that there's an easier path of entry and also entry for a much more diverse workforce as well across the board. But also recognising that more needs to be done in terms of the structure of the vocational training sector. So working that out as well, and you'll know there's been a huge amount of work to be done in that as well. Probably need to recognise as well just the climate aspect, and I think we need to spend more time, and we'll be spending more time, making sure that our construction methods are more climate change aware, if you like, and also that the buildings and infrastructure that we build takes that into account, not only in terms of carbon emissions, which is critical, but also in terms of adaptation, that the buildings we build now need to be both efficient and resilient given the changes that are there. There's a whole lot more to talk about, but it's probably more appropriate if we just go for a bit of a conversation at this point.
So talking about the construction industry accord, do you support the party support the accord as it is, or do you want it to change?
Oh, look, I think the accord is a great first step, but we've got to recognise, I think, that it's an ongoing negotiation. It's a relationship. It's not a static agreement. So that as we implement the accord, I think there'll be better understandings and also more advantages to be taken, and that's where we need to go. I don't think there's any immediate flaws that leap to mind, but I don't think we can accept that it can't be improved on.
Relationships, so where are the tensions then?
Oh, look, I'm not sure there's tensions in the relationship, but I think there's advantages to be gained. So things like, there's obviously things like retention payments that we need to look at, and just the whole framework around the power imbalances that exist within the construction industry and how we can address those, because I don't think we can imagine for a moment that the construction industry is a monolith that speaks with entirely one voice. So we need to understand what the most equitable arrangements are to deal with things like construction risk. And we know that if we leave the construction industry alone entirely, the risk will fall pretty heavily on the smaller players. So we need to make sure that things like retention payments and bonds and director responsibility are adequately dealt with. And one way around that is by things like providing template construction contracts, which have a kind of nudge parties towards where those risks should fall. But regulation is also another way around it.
With procurement, what policy are you going to use to stop so much risk being transferred in government contracts to the industry? The rise
Yeah.
that we've seen has damaged the industry.
Yeah, look, and so government obviously has a leadership role in procurement. In terms of construction and infrastructure, it's a massive purchaser of those across the industry, and we accept that we have a role to play in setting, having the right settings there. And obviously any construction contract negotiation has tensions within it. But you're right that we need to make sure that we're not simply driving down prices, because we know that if that's our bottom line and our only bottom line, you end up with a high risk on the contractor and a low trust environment, and we can't have that. So we absolutely need to be contracting with a much more broad base of considerations. And I think we need to understand that how the contractor is participating in the wider construction sector is important, and the financial resilience, and not squeezing every drop out of juice out of that lemon, because we do want financially resilient. We don't want corporate failure, but equally we want fair and reasonable margins and profits. And there's always a balance to be struck there. But I mean, the kind of contracting that sometimes happens, where it's an all or nothing arrangement without an ability to continually adjust the relationship for changing circumstances, both around the building conditions, but also around the market, that needs to be taken into account. So look, I can understand that in the construction sector, the stronger parties, and the government's one of those, have a natural pull to shifting all of the risk onto the market, and that's something we've got to keep a close eye on to make sure that we have a healthy construction sector.
So on that score, the basic contract NZS 3910 is currently being looked at. Would you put more funding into overhauling that contract?
Oh, look, first of all, I should have said this earlier. I apologise for Minister Salisa not being here. She's otherwise engaged, and it's not in my gift to put more funding into a contract review. But certainly, I think what needs to be done is you need to stand back a long way when you look at those contracts, and look at it not only in terms of the relationship between the two parties to the contract, but also in the way that contract sits in the market overall. So very committed to a thorough review.
Your policy would be to aim to streamline that contract further and make it fairer.
Yeah, absolutely, and more workable.
What about broadening the building levy to resource that type of work?
The bill that's before the House at the moment also relaxes a little bit the way in which the building levy can be used. I think we've got to be really cautious because levies, whilst not strictly a tax, they're still an impost on the building sector. And it's very easy to say it should be used for one thing or another. But if you require it to do more work, you're going to require more of a levy. So let's be cautious about that. Having said that, if the idea of a levy is that it's used in a direct way for the industry from which it comes, and in that sense, I see some merit in using the levy for wider work. But let's make sure we don't fund whole departments on the back of the construction industry because they're serving the building industry. That's a job for the general taxation as well.
Has your intention to make the way retentions are held more watertight?
Yes, absolutely. Retentions are critical, and there's two strands to it. One is to get the rules right so that they can't be stretched and retentions can't be used to fund cash flow or whatever it might be. The other is that when there are rule breakers, to make sure that they're actually punished. Because if you think of what a retention is, it's money that's held for someone else. It's not the business's money to use in their general accounts, and to do so is essentially a misappropriation, and it should be treated as such. So we're looking at making it an offence to breach the retention rules.
Okay. In the area of building regulation, do you support and would aim for bringing in mandatory third-party certification of building products?
Yeah, look, building product certification, I'm probably not in a good position to talk about that in detail, but certainly building product certification is something that absolutely is before select committee as well, simply because of also provision of effective information on a uniform basis, because there's so many building products, and the risk is that we see building products coming into the country which are not certified and do not have good information, and they may be good for one purpose, but they're put to another, and that leads to defective construction and building practices. So we recognise that that's something that needs to be looked at, and that's what we're looking at.
But you're stopping short of mandatory independent certification.
Yeah, I'm not going to commit to that now. No.
Okay. Modern methods of construction, you support that being useful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, modern methods of construction is a kind of catch-all term, but absolutely need to step up to using construction methods which use all of the technology at our disposal, and that the regulatory framework around those catches up. So if we look, for example, at modular buildings, the idea of having to consent every element of a modular building once it's constructed is essentially an impediment to modular buildings being used. So the bill that's before the House at the moment would look at essentially certifying the factory or the business that constructs the module and audits it on a regular basis. So that's your quality check, rather than a product by product, if you like. If you think of a module being a product, rather than looking at every product on an individual basis. And that should be a real streamlining of essentially factory-based construction of either whole buildings or parts of buildings.
You're going to be able to certify factories even if they're overseas, eh?
Well, that raises challenges, but there's no particular conceptual bar to a New Zealand auditor going overseas and auditing and certifying an offshore producer. And we've got to recognise that the economy, that we now have a world economy, and we have world trade obligations which say that we can't put unreasonable barriers in the place of offshore competition. So look, if there's a business in New Zealand that wants to do part of its work in a factory in Australia or elsewhere, then there should not be a barrier to that auditing occurring. Getting the auditor there and paying for it might be a cost barrier, but we can't create it as a kind of de facto regulatory barrier.
How do you intend to use the government's buying power to advance modular building?
That's probably something better aimed at the Minister for Housing. But look, given that we think that modular building is a place for efficiencies, and given that the government of the day, whoever that might be, is one of the biggest builders, certainly of residential houses in the country, I would be surprised if we didn't look closely at that.
So would you consider using going order to get them to buy modular houses, state houses?
What I'm saying is Kaingaora is essentially as a state entity. I would expect it to look at modular housing, and if there's efficiencies to be gained, it's certainly in a position to get those given the volume that it's building. I mean, you'll have seen the 8,000 house commitment over, I think it's 4 years, and if you can you do that using a modular construction method, that's got to be a good thing to do.
The overhaul in the area of people and their capacity and capabilities, big changes there in terms of the training framework. What's the party's policy on that? Is that now set, and those, are there going to be further big changes, or are we set for the near future?
Oh, look, I think the major changes to the vocational education framework, I think they are now in place. They certainly will have to be worked out because it's still a relatively recent change, but the major changes are in place. The apprenticeships funding, that's essentially a COVID response at the present time, but we recognise, and you'll have seen our education policy released recently, where we stepped back from funding fully giving fees free for tertiary education at university level, and refocus that in the kind of trades apprenticeship level. So that's a real signal that we see our economy and our productivity to be best enhanced by putting more resources into the trades and into the construction industry than some of the other areas that might otherwise have been funded.
How are you going to make sure you put the resources in the right places, that you're training the right type of workers?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important point. And I just note as an aside that given our immigration situation, training is really going to be of critical importance. And I think communication is a critical aspect of that. That's what the construction sector accord is all about, having a close relationship with industry, and really working with the training sector to recruit people into the right trades and send the right signals and getting that pipeline right, because it's no use having kind of bulges if we don't have the people coming through, and recognizing that it's industry's role as well to provide the jobs and keep the people in jobs, so that we don't have a problem. And this is essentially part of the COVID response. We don't have a problem in lean times having flight from the industry. Now, government and other businesses have a job in keeping the pipeline of work as stable as possible, but that's never going to be perfect. So there's a bit of a bit of a compromise to be reached there.
Just on the COVID front, so a lot of talk about shovel ready, about horizontal, but what about the other sectors in the construction industry who are under a lot of pressure? Thinking of architects, engineers, consultants, many of them may have work on their books now, but not looking ahead into 2021. What's the plan if you're in government for them? What can they expect? Have you got anything that can help their businesses out?
Look, there's a huge amount of work out there, and I think if anything, the question will be whether there's capacity, because even our school rebuild program, that alone is a massive program for those kinds of people. The roading program, the rail program, they are huge projects, and the risk that we see is the next 6-9 months in the lag getting those from a consented or nearly consented situation to actually getting things happening. So the amount, and you'll have seen, if you haven't seen the graphs, we haven't been waving it around enough, but you'll have seen the amount of money committed to infrastructure has risen astronomically over the past 3 years, and is intended to do so even more in the next 4. So look, the work is certainly there, and what we see is that is exactly what's happening. It's the pipeline is filling up very rapidly.
And yet the vertical sector is feeling left out. So what is the policy to make sure that vertical and horizontal are balanced in the COVID response?
Well, in terms of the vertical stuff, I've mentioned schools. the hospital builds that are going on. Dunedin Hospital's going to come online very soon. There's a lot of vertical stuff out there as well. Obviously, the government's only a portion of the sector, and one of the reasons the government's stepping up its spending is because of the risk that we see that the private sector kind of pegs back to wait and see what happens with the wider economy, including the global economy. But look, we think we're putting committing a lot of funds, a huge amount of funds, both to vertical and horizontal through health, education, and transport. That's a massive amount of money.
What about councils? You could free up more money for councils who put a lot of their projects on hold. If you're in government, wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, look, and there's a real question around councils who are putting projects on hold. Councils have, by and large, pretty good balance sheets, and they've got a rating base, and there is no clear reason why councils should be putting projects on hold, and it's exactly the kind of cyclical behaviour that the private sector we can understand engage in, but the public sector, including councils, should recognise they have a part to play. Now, look, we're very happy, and you'll have seen the COVID response resource management fast track bill. We're very happy to look at council projects and for them to engage in a fast track consenting process if needs be to get it underway. But given the billions upon billions of dollars that the central government has committed to infrastructure, including these shovel-ready projects, some of which were council projects, I don't think it's reasonable for local bodies to be putting their hands out because they want to contract their own spending at the government's expense.
Building regulation reform has been initiated in this term. What's the policy in terms of advancing that in order to move the industry further and further away from global cheapest wins that we've had to date? What can we envisage if you're in power that will be going through?
In respect of regulatory reform and the kind of race to the bottom that you allude to, firstly, procurement is one aspect of that. So I think that the ability to adjust the procurement rules to recognise the behaviour of the contractor in terms of its equity, to recognise the use of, again, I've mentioned the World Trade Organization before, we can't prohibit offshore products, but we can look at equitable products that are produced in a sustainable way in a fair employment market. So that's essentially ethical product sourcing. And that's the kind of things that we can ask, and it might not be as linear and as spreadsheet oriented as perhaps a pricing mechanism, but we can certainly take those kind of factors into account. And if we do that and we ask how things are produced, where they're produced, and of course what their quality and longevity is, then we can perhaps get a better product at the end of the day.
Aside from product, talking about the people doing the job, do you intend to create and introduce higher thresholds, for instance, having more use of preferred contractors, extending the LBP scheme, anything like that?
Look, I don't have that information at my fingertips, and I don't think that there's necessarily a proposal to extend that scheme. But certainly looking at the workforce and how a contractor is engaging with it, things like how many apprentices they're using, what their training record is, those things will become relevant, as well as diversity of the workforce. And look, I'll just mention as well that there is also, in terms of diversity and using Māori providers, the kind of making sure that if we're doing this kind of work, we're distributing it equitably, both in terms of across the industry, but also our treaty obligations. That's certainly something which government will consider.
On sustainability and resilience, what's the policy to get more building done that takes account of climate change?
recognize, essentially that's work ahead. Absolutely need to do that. In terms of things like the building code, we need to have a very close look at that. And as I said, I think in my opening, we need to look both at building resilient buildings that take into account adaptation, so the recognition in terms of changing weather patterns, sea level rise, and those kinds of aspects. But we also need to be building buildings which are more sustainable. So making sure that we've got the right, that when we're giving buildings green stars, that they're making sense, and where that threshold should be. Um, I think we need to look carefully at the balance between building affordable buildings, affordable housing in particular, and buildings that will last, and buildings which have a low carbon footprint.
What policy would you use to incentivize that? You've got to be able to move people towards that, like you do with electric cars. How are you going to move them?
Yeah, look, I think that's something that we can absolutely look at. The Green Investment Fund is something that has been used in that area around Wellington Port. So that's actually a commercial loan scheme. Science and innovation is a massive area. We need to be encouraging our research sector to be innovating around the materials we're using and how that occurs, and that feeds into the licensing issue as well. But look, in terms of subsidising whole houses, I don't think we're quite there. What we'd like to see is products coming onto the market which are better products, and ideally New Zealand products.
What about a policy to reduce landfill, builders' waste going to landfill?
Yeah, waste is a massive issue, and we know that builders' waste is a large part of what does go to landfill, and that it's expensive. So the waste levy has recently increased, but I think we need to encourage, and I think with good building practice, the waste that goes to landfill can be reduced substantially. So we need to be incentivising builders to reduce that waste, because the best place for a building material is not in the tip, it's in the building itself. And good building practices can achieve that. And so we need to incentivise that as well. But that's also education and training and building practice.